Hello, everybody. Have a good evening, have a good day, or in which time ever you are living. Welcome to the Continuous Testing Meetup Online. And first of all, I want to say thank you to Source Labs, TUI, and Trendig for providing the swag and for the time and the opportunity to work here, and also to Aurelian, who is my co-host today. And first of all, whatever comes up in this meetup, you can rewatch it on continuoustestingmeetup.com. Also, some previous meetups, that's not a problem. But it will be online like in a few days, probably already Monday, today, tomorrow. Well, and now we hand over to Butch, who's telling us something about unlocking Playwright's powers with tips and tricks beyond the basics. So, Butch, it's your stage now.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. Let me pull up the slide deck here and we will get underway. All right, let's see if I could get a thumbs up from somebody or a notification. Y'all can see unlocking Playwright's power slide.
Yes, we can.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I am super excited to be here. Like I was telling our host earlier, anytime I see this go live on LinkedIn, I will click in and listen along and always have some great takeaways. So I'm hoping that through this conversation, through this presentation, you'll have a few takeaways when it comes to Playwright and some of the more advanced features. That you can use in your own testing. But before we get in, I know AI testing is it's a big thing. Everybody's talking about AI or AI powered testing. I just want us to remind everybody really what AI testing is all about. It's about being the best prompt engineer you can be. Um, I see this and I laugh at it, but I also know that a lot of what AI is today, a lot of the way people are leveraging AI in testing, is really about creating the best prompts. And my career depends on it, bro. Like, let's make sure we get this right. I do believe there's a future in AI and leveraging it in testing, and I've used AI even to generate uh, some ideas and even two of the tests towards the end of the presentation. So I'm not throwing eggs or tomatoes at it, but it is overhyped in some ways. But in a lot of ways, it's underhyped. I think we're going to continue to learn new uses for it, as new tools get introduced. But before we dive into kind of Playwright and what we're here for, I like to show this login flow. So when you picture a system that you've tested or a system that you want to create some test automation tests for, typically the first place you're going to start is like a login flow, right? Let's make sure login works. That's one of the most critical areas of a lot of web applications. So I'm going to use this as a model to help us really understand and see what are the different levels in just a web application login flow, what that looks like. So um, this concept or idea was first introduced to me by Mark Winningham and Richard Bradshaw in a course that I took with them called Automation and Testing. And they called this the like visual task analysis. So here's a system, let's break it down. What are the different layers of the system? And a lot of the way my brain thinks about test automation really revolves around thinking about a system. What are those different layers and where do I want to automate the things I want to automate, right? So it's not just automating all the things, it's automating the right things at the right levels. And today's presentation is really going to focus on Playwright. Not really, I mean, we're going to hit the UI layer, but a lot of our testing is really going to be between the UI and the API. So it's really going to be like focus here, and just a lot of the tests I'm going to demonstrate are really validating the UI, but it's intercepting or talking to this API layer. So if we just like walk through what a login would look like through a typical site. You've got your UI where you might have a username and a password. You've got a submit button that you can interact with. You click that button, and on the submit, some JavaScript executes. It sends an API request. It might have gotten a CSFR token from the UI or from the DOM if that exists. It sends that to a service. The service might validate the CSFR token is valid. If it's valid, let's also validate the credentials. If everything's good, it might talk to a database. It might log the attempt or the success. The service is going to say, hey, you're authorized to be here. Let me give you some keys. Let me give you a cookie. Let me give you a token that you can use. That's going to get surfaced back up through the API, typically in a response. So maybe like a 200 status code response with some body, some headers. Maybe it sets a cookie. And then some JavaScript is going to do something with that response. And typically it will redirect you, or if you're not allowed, it's going to reload and say, hey, try again. But typically this is a typical flow, right? We've got all these different layers in our logic, everything from the UI all the way to the database. DOM to database is kind of one way to think about it. There's also, I like to think about like interface to database. So is it the UI interface that's interacting with the database? Is it the AI or the API interface to the database? There's lots of different ways you can test an application or even test this login flow. And typically, traditionally, when you think about UI testing, you think all I'm doing is interacting with a UI, and I'm going to do everything there, and I'm going to go validate everything looks good on the other side. We've been doing that for a long time. Today, hopefully, I'm going to introduce you to some tools, some concepts that kind of break that apart and give you more options when you're testing things. And I'll give you some examples that I've used, specifically, kind of looking at this API layer. So you're ready? Let's do this. All right. There's going to be a good bit of example code on the screen, and I'm also going to demo as well. So we're going to see these tests in action. So there's going to be a little bit of back and forth. I apologize for that, but this is where we are. Before we dive in here, I do want to share the website that I'm going to be using or showing these examples off of is practicesoftwaretesting.com. It is a modern web app that's built for software testing that we're going to be using. So feel free to go check this out, explore along with me. Know that this is what we're doing. And I believe if you look in the chat, there should be some links up at the top that you can go click on to check things out. Also, just post that there. All right. Also, just all the things I'm going to show off are examples in a repository that you could download today and go run these on your local machine. So those are also available that we can share a link as well. All right. So let's dive in. The first example I really want to show off is the idea of intercepting an API request. And, the concept here is going to be, I'm going to go to a web page. It's going to get a bunch of data. And rather than me having to, let's just go back to our page. Our specific test is going to be from the screen, all these different products load, combination pliers, bolt cutters. Typically, if I'm going to make a UI assertion, I want to assert that something exists on the screen, right? So the test data problem, which is a very difficult problem to solve in automation, is I need to know what I need to assert against. So I need to know combination pliers is going to exist, and I need to know it's going to be $14.15, and it's not going to be out of stock, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, depending on how deep my assertions want to go. So this first concept or idea we're going to look at is in the network tab. If I refresh this page and so I've opened Chrome DevTools, I've gone to the network tab, I've filtered all my requests for these fetch XHR requests, and I'm going to go find this products API endpoint. And this products API endpoint has a data, an array of objects, and each of these objects is combination pliers. So let's dive into this. There's a description, It's in stock true. There's a price down here. So all this data is really getting loaded, not just from a static HTML page, it's being dynamically generated from this API call. And when you're dealing with a system like this, you can do really fun things like intercept API calls and do things with those. So for this example, we're going to use some advanced, page routing functionality in Playwright to actually intercept this softwaretesting.com products, API request, and we're going to do something with the response. So this line of code here is basically is creating a route in Playwright. This route is going to wait for a response. It's going to get the data from the response. It's going to set it to a variable called response. And then I'm going to create a products variable, which I've actually created outside of this route so I can use it later in my test. And I'm basically going to get the JSON response for products. And then I'm going to continue my route. So in actuality, what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, everything that's in this data block, which are, the product arrays, I want to save those as a variable within my test. So I go to the page, it routes this API call, it saves some variables, and then later in my test, I'm going to go to the page. I'm going to basically make sure it loads. And then in this next section, I'm going to say, hey, in this product grid, this big grid that exists, I'm going to do a for each loop. And I'm going to pass in a name and a price. And I'm going to assert on each of those boxes to make sure that those basically contain the product name and they contain the product price. And so this is like the idea is we're intercepting this API request. We're using the data to validate the UI. So my test data problem, which I had before, do I need to actually assert that combination pliers exist? If I have other tests that are actually testing the API layer and I have confidence that my API is working, my test really just needs to be, I need to make sure what's coming from the API gets rendered properly in the UI. And that's really what this test is doing. It also saves me a good bit of time, and I'm actually also able to do more assertions. So if something does come back, like, maybe, for example, in this scenario, a developer made a change that basically broke the price not showing if something's out of stock. This test would catch that subtle change because I'm actually testing against all the different types of data that's coming back in that request or that response. So just to kind of see that in action, I mean, that's what it is. It's pretty straightforward. Let's just debug this. One thing I really like about Playwright, similar to Cypress, is I can debug things and really investigate and see different variables as they're happening. So I've debugged this. We've got this products variable that's been set. It's basically got this array of data, and I can also see that over here. And pretty much what this test is doing, like if I were to step through this test, is it's going through, it's getting the first name, it's asserting, and you can kind of see like these things that are kind of highlighted. It basically did a bunch of assertions. Each of those like milliseconds is different assertions that were made. So things passed. My test is happy. That's one way that you can just use some of this, intercepting a network request, getting it and using it in your testing to just, help short circuit that test data creation process. So there's one example. Let's go to example number 2, aborting API requests. So the same way that you can intercept things, there's also tools that Playwright offers to abort these things. So in this specific example, my example, I guess, from work that really called me to like use this was we have this dashboard that loads and we have a whole bunch of test data, and this dashboard literally takes like 20 seconds to load because we have way too much test data. We're in a staging environment. And really what I wanted to test has nothing to do with this network request. I really just need to validate something else loads properly on the page. So we basically introduced this abort call. So when the page loads, if it sees this long running thing that I don't care about, I'm going to abort it so I can continue on with my test. So what this looks like for an example is, we've got our test step. We are getting this API called category/tree, and I've got 2 stars here, which basically say, it's a wild card type thing. And anytime it sees this path, it's going to just abort that request and continue on with what we're doing. So for my example, I actually create an expect to validate that the get by text short name AZ kind of element to not contain power tools. So, what that looks like over here is there is a API call called category/tree. And within that API call, we get a response that is, it's an array of stuff. One of the items in this array is power tools. So you can kind of see it in this section here. And what my test does is basically validates that this kind of element doesn't include power tools if we're aborting this API request, right? So it would be the same thing if I were manually testing this. I could right click this. I could block this URL. I could refresh my page, and now this category stuff is not going to load until I go and unblock it. So what's really useful there is I can programmatically do that as a part of my API test and really short circuit and really hone in and test the things I care about and abort things I don't care about. This is also really useful if there are like images or something you don't really care about, or maybe it's Google ads that load on your page. Like, hopefully you're not testing something that has Google ads in a test environment, but if you're doing that, you can also abort anything coming from the Google ad server or things like that. So a lot of really cool things you can do with this abort functionality that exist. So number 3, and this is one, I think between number 1 and 2, this third one is probably the one I use it just as much as the first 2. And that's the idea of, as you are, getting an API response back, rather than just mock it, which is like a popular thing to do. We'll get to that. Rather than mock it from scratch, what if we actually just modified the response? So instead of mocking the whole thing, what if I just said, hey, instead of something being, a specific name or a specific price or a specific in stock value, what if I just updated the specifics of that? So in this scenario, we're going back to the products. We've created a page route, and we're basically getting the response. And then from the response, I've set that to a variable. I'm basically going to mock this data. So I'm saying my JSON data, the first value in the array. I want to set the name to mock product. I'm going to set the price to something that's not like a normal price, but we're going to mock it and see. And I'm going to set in stock to false. And then this await route fulfill will basically, take that response that it grabbed, update, the first value in the array, and then, fulfill the rest of it. And then in this scenario, my assertions down here are, I'm being a little more verbose because I've actually got a specific data that I've set, which I could make that a variable and just kind of set it once and pass it through. But for this example, I just want to keep it simple and basically mock your product data. So again, this short circuit some of that test data creation problem where if I have confidence the API works the way it should work, I can I'm really just validating the UI is rendering these responses from the API properly. And I can kind of fake that, but it's not a whole mock. It's really just like a partial mock. What's also really nice about this is if a new value gets added, it's going to automatically not be touched by my test. Like if the new value that's added in the API response actually breaks the UI, we'll know about it without having to go recreate mocks. So let's go see what that looks like in action. So it's going to be down here. I'm just going to play the test. It's going to go really, really fast. And we're going to go just pull up our browser and see that our mock product is here. It's out of stock. We've done our assertions on that and everything passed. Everything's good. So, one of the drawbacks to kind of mocking data like this is if I were to click this link, it's going to go to a page that's not mock data. It's back to combination pliers. So, a lot of like building your test and kind of thinking through what are you testing, what layer are you testing, what are you trying to validate, comes into play. So if you wanted to do like a true end to end, go do this thing, go to the next page, do some more detailed tests, mocking or updating, modifying a request, maybe not the right answer, but it really depends on what you're testing and kind of where your focus is. So hopefully that is helpful to somebody. We have used this a ton to really just validate really quick UI things, make sure that errors are handled properly and whatnot. It's very, very nice. All right, so a new feature I think the Playwright team released, I guess probably in the past year, maybe year and a half, is this idea to route from a HAR file. So if you're familiar with like the network tab or working with HAR files previously, you can basically, from this session, I've got these different API calls that exist. I can right click, maybe it's right click here, and I've got ways to save a session, basically like save all these requests into a HAR file. I'm actually, maybe it's down here. There it is. Copy as a HAR. So basically like I can get all my network requests, save them to like a HAR file, which can then be used or popped into like Wireshark or any other network analyzation tools. Well, the Playwright team, they built a way where you can basically save these HAR files locally and use them for a request. So for this specific example, we're actually not establishing a route. So this one's a little different, but we're basically saying in our test, I've got a step to route from a HAR. And I basically created this .hars folder with a product.har. And we've got this URL that we are passing in. So anytime this URL is hit, it's actually going to look in this HAR file and prevent it from there. And if I wanted to update this, so let's say I wanted to run a test and actually get like a new copy of the network request to save in my repo, I could just set that to true and it would go update the HAR file. So it's kind of like some built-in saving of network request. I have not used this like at scale on a really big project. I would assume that all these HAR files could get really, they could get really, really full. So it's just something to consider. But let's go look and see what that looks like. So in our HAR file, I've basically created, again, this HARS directory. So let's click on that. And I've committed this to my repo. So when this runs in the cloud or runs in CI, it's going to literally use this file. This has detailed information about what's going on. What's also kind of nice about a HAR file and about our next example that I'm going to show off is if I wanted to, I could come in here and update this HAR file. So I could come in and say, hey, for the response or for any of the details, I could come in and actually change these things. And I think this specific product HAR is kind of like a description file. The actual data is going to be in this big long string. Again, these are probably not the easiest thing to kind of maintain as you get bigger. But as you can see, this is a JSON response. In this ID, I've updated the name to Happy Path Pliers. So when this test runs, it's basically looking for this value, Happy Path Pliers. So let's go see what that looks like. So this is what it's asserting against. So I'm going to run this. So let's go find our thing. So we've got Happy Path Pliers. So what's nice about this is this was all generated from this HAR file. Also, what that means is all this other metadata that's included in the combination plier stuff, things like IDs, URLs, pictures, if there's anything that's like specifically tied to a database, such as like the ID that I'm going to click on that you can kind of see in the link down below, this page, when I click on it, is not going to load because this ID doesn't exist, right? This website we're testing against, it resets every 15 minutes or so. So this ID that I captured when I was arranging this test doesn't exist anymore. So again, there are pros and cons to different approaches depending on what problem you're trying to solve, but there's also some pitfalls depending on like what all information you want to do with those. And again, as you can see, as I reloaded the page, it didn't load from the HAR. It loaded kind of from the API because it was outside of the context of the test that was run. So that is another way. So in similar light, you can request with HAR files. That's kind of one way to do it. You can also do this via JSON files. So let's say I don't want to manage a bunch of like HAR files, but I'm okay managing some JSON that's just some test data that's going to be a part of our repo. And this is the way to do that. So because we're not using the default HAR, we're going to go set up a page route again. We're going to put a route on this categories tree. And then I've commented this code out right here, but this code is basically what you could uncomment to save the response file from the actual HTTP request. So you can quickly, generate a new response if you need to. And then down here, I'm going to parse the JSON categories that I would have saved up here. And then I'm just going to fulfill the JSON, right? This test tools JSON. And then I'm going to go validate some different things in the test. So in this scenario, I'm actually validating that Playwright exists. So let's go look at our test and the actual JSON that I've created. So what I did is I ran this code, I saved my JSON, and then I went into my JSON and I went ahead and updated I updated instead of hand tools to test tools, and I created some different test tools that we use. And let's go see what that looks like. So the test passed. So I can come look at the test and see I've got my test tools here, and it validated that Playwright is there in the list. So again, this is just some different ways to kind of manage your test data and use some of the more advanced features to actually, test things that maybe aren't easy to test just by, creating a bunch of test data. All right, next section. This one is actually, I had a lot of fun just kind of like learning about this and using this. And, it led me to a bunch of other ideas that we could use, but simulating a slow network. If you've ever done any kind of testing, right, there's different things that can impact the speed of your test. Some of those are not always a slow network. Some of them are the server that's under test. Maybe it's under a lot of load. Maybe it's a staging server that's way underpowered, doesn't match production. But there are also situations where, hey, I want to validate that if it takes 5 seconds for a response to come in, how does our system behave? What happens when that happens? I've also found this like really useful to use if I'm trying to like get a tricky element that kind of disappears really fast. You can also kind of use this to kind of like, cheat your way out of it. So you kind of like pause the network as things are going. So let's take a look at what this looks like. For this specific case, I wanted to actually like create an assertion that would be realistic. So let's just like come pop over here to our test site, and I'm actually going to I'm going to block the products request and refresh the page. And you can see that while no products are loaded, you've got this like nice little shimmer that exists on the page. So this is kind of like a placeholder. If I went in and actually looked at the DOM, I could actually see what it looks like. As soon as that request finishes, the DOM's going to change. Those elements aren't going to be there in the DOM anymore. But what this allowed me to do was, hey, I can like pause this, or I want to make sure that this thing is actually loading. And then when the request does finish, that it actually goes away. So in our test over here, actually, I'm going to go back to our presentation, which kind of walks us through it a little easier. I'm going to set up a route. In this route, I'm looking for this products endpoint, and I'm going to route any requests that come to that. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a 4-second wait in place. And then I'm just going to continue. So by default, anytime this API request is hit, it's going to take 4 seconds before the request is actually fulfilled to the browser. So again, we're intercepting that network traffic through Playwright and then passing it on. So here, I'm actually going to go to the page. I'm going to ensure that the skeleton wrapper exists, or basically, I think here I'm actually setting up locators. And then I'm basically setting up this animation props and doing some JavaScript stuff to make sure that these locators are, these styles are basically in place while it runs. So ideally, with Playwright's like auto waiting mechanisms, Playwright is basically going to wait until this thing exists or a timeout happens. So as this, return stuff is going in, or as this expectation is happening, it's actually going to wait until that's there. And once this is all running, everything is going to be good. Once this wait for timeout gets fulfilled, it's actually going to expect this image box, which is what we're kind of validating up here, the skeleton locator. We're actually going to say, hey, the skeleton locator, which is, this right here, is actually not going to be visible once everything gets loaded. So all these different things, like the DOM is going to change. So let's go. I'm going to just unblock this, refresh it, and see that there's no skeleton loaders here anymore. Everything's actually rendered properly. So the test is just making sure that those don't exist once the route is fulfilled. So this is, somewhat of a unique test, but in a lot of times we're going to need, a unique solution to be able to solve these things. So you saw that, this wait for timeout kind of waited, 4 seconds. I'm actually going to play this again, and we're going to watch the browser. So we'll watch that load. 4 seconds finishes. The things load. We assert that those skeletons aren't there. The test finished. Everything passes. So this is just another interesting, unique way you can kind of use this Playwright page routing in your test. All right. So another thing that I've run into, at least in my latest role, just doing SRE things, is rate limiting. Getting rate limited because something happens. So we actually have a test in our system. How does our UI respond when a rate limit occurs? And that's really what we're doing here. We're using the same route, and instead of like fulfilling JSON or the original request, we're actually going to just respond a status code of 429 and the body with too many requests, and just validating that things load properly. So in this scenario, right, if the request is not loading, more than likely the shimmer is just going to be there. But I can go here. Let's just run this. I'm going to go ahead and open up DevTools so we can actually see the network requests. I'm going to run this test one more time so we can see these network requests getting loaded. So if I go down here, I can see this request is 429, too many responses. The response is too many requests, and our page is doing what I expect it to do. But again, you kind of have complete control over the browser and the network requests as your tests are running, which opens up a ton of opportunities to do, one-off tests like this that, may be useful depending on the size and the scope of your team. All right, so that's what I got. That's my presentation. I hope there's something there that you have walked away with, but I'm definitely open to asking, y'all giving me any questions. Before we do that, I would just shout out, I write at a blog, playwrightsolutions.com. Sometimes it's consistent, sometimes it's not, but feel free. Like if you like what you see, you're more interested about other interesting playwright solutions, feel free to go subscribe, check that out. Um, but for now, I will stop sharing my screen and I'll take any questions.
Though, first of all, there's one question in the chat. Um, it was during your session when you said something about aborting the HTML or the API request, and it's how I can handle this approach in case of server-side render page when everything data HTML JS is returned in one single API call. Page could be
Yes,
empty because I aborted when whole HTML page in response, right?
that is correct. So if everything is server side rendered, this approach is not going to be applicable to you. You could definitely, I guess, intercept the whole page and go do some finds and replaces if you need to. But I mean, at that point, you know, if you go back to your visual task analysis, right? Really, you're making one request. It is doing everything server side. It's rendering you this one thing. You're not going to be able to intercept additional kind of network requests or mock anything out that's not returned from the server. So, probably the best approach there is, either lower level kind of unit level tests or just, those full end to end tests that we're used to. I've actually, I mean, it's probably been 6 or 7 years since I've worked on like a system like that. And our approach was definitely we would update the database to kind of create our data and then make this call and get all the data and validate that it rendered properly on the UI. But again, it's, we kind of went a layer deeper. We had to build our own DB interface to be able to write data. And it was not the right decision well, it's not a right decision long term ever, probably. But it felt like the right decision at the time because it unlocked just a ton of time to be able to write those tests, have confidence in our regression test cycle that we didn't break anything. There were a few gotchas where the database changed and we had to go update a lot of our data factories that created that data, but that's how I've solved that problem in the past.
So, Andreas, I hope your question is answered. Any more questions from your side?
Awesome. I hear a lot of people excited about like this being helpful. That fills my heart. Like, I mean, I was telling the organizers of the conference, like a lot of what brings me joy is just helping other people. There have been people in my life that have helped me, technically have helped me, just in work life. And I love pouring back in and helping others. So
I think Milos is sending over a new question. When we should completely mock, what if we have more external services we want to test in isolation? Opinion on setup? Any reliable library for mocking with nice integration with Playwright?
So I'll throw this out there. I mean, this is my opinion. My opinion is um very rarely am I gonna like want to mock everything. I typically will never do that unless I'm testing one very specific thing, just because there are a lot of changes in between systems and having an end to end gives me more confidence. I do think if you're working on a really large team and you've got a ton of dependencies right now, I've got like 8 developers and we have like 4 or 5 services. So that's my context. For other contexts, it probably makes a ton of more sense. I don't know any like specific tools that are really good at mocking. I don't have experience. I've seen a bunch of blog posts about different options, but I don't have any experience like specifically with those. So, um, but yeah, in the end, if you want completely mocking, if you're lower on the unit level, I think the lower the unit, the lower you are to the unit level testing, I think mocking is more okay. But even that, it can just be difficult to maintain, right? There's a pretty big maintenance cost to mocking if things are changing, right? If things aren't changing, um, yeah, I mean, the fear there is like, what if something does change and your mock isn't updated? Like, there's another risk just to consider. So, if anybody does have any ideas or mocking frameworks, feel free to throw them in the chat or come off mute. I'd love to hear about them.
So there we got it. Thank you. So I think that question is answered somehow. Next question from Nathan. Taking the example site you're using, if you had to complete ordering the tool or product, how could these concepts work with that, since completing an order could involve a multitude of tasks and systems firing off?
Great question. I would take the approach, and I probably have an example, but pretty much if I can scrape it on the UI, right? So, for example, I want to go through a checkout process using a specific product. If I know what product I'm going to click on, one, I can get the ID, the unique ID to kind of like gather all that data to save its variables, which I can then go use in my assertions, right? So if I click this button and add it to cart, on my assertion side, I want to go check my cart and make sure that this name, this ID, this price is actually in the cart. And you can scrape the screen to get that information, or you can just get that back from the API. So there's a couple different ways to do that, but ideally, ideally, if there's any specific IDs that are automatically generated from the system, that's where kind of like intercepting the request, getting the data and using that data in your assertions, that first example I showed, I would probably use that for that whole checkout flow, and just to validate that, hey, on my checkout receipt, all this stuff, was actually checked out and paid for. So that's kind of one approach that I would use for that, especially when you're doing like a full end-to-end test with multiple steps. But mocking in that scenario would not work, right? I mean, it doesn't exist server side. So it could be interested to, yeah, just make sure you're following all of the rules of your company site, or you have permission if you're automating a production site.
Yeah. So thank you, first of all, for this great presentation. Yeah, it was really nice. Oh, we just got another question. Anyways, just let me finish the sentence.
Yeah.
I really
Yeah.
appreciate it. It was fun. Now to the next question. Is this intercepting a boarding request fine with parallel execution?
Awesome. So great question. The way Playwright works is for every single browser that comes up, a brand new browser context get created. So any network request or anything like that is in the scope of that test with its own browser context, assuming you're using the Playwright test framework that I was using. If you're using, like, if you're kind of rolling your own or using Java or Python and you're bringing your own test runner, those have to be kind of configured a certain way. But if you're using Playwright test out of the box, a boarding request on one test is not going to affect a boarding request on another test in a different browser, even if they're running at the same time. You're welcome.
Okay, this time I will wait a bit more. Another 5 seconds more, maybe.
I will ask one question, a tricky one. Don't you agree with me that this approach may have some drawbacks if your application is relying, for instance, in external APIs? Meaning, let's say that your application is relying in internal APIs and external. If we are doing this, we are reverse engineering some external APIs. We are mocking, which is good. But whenever this is going to be changed, we have to adapt. So in my opinion, in these cases, it's cheaper to test without any mock. What is your opinion on this? I mean, do you have recommendation use cases more for this usage, for example?
Yeah, great question. One, I think one of the pros to like a mock, so specifically the third party scenario, if you don't have an easy way to return a response in a test environment, so let's say I work with a payments gateway and my payment processor, I want to initiate what a decline looks like, but they don't have any test numbers for me to initiate a decline. But I know what a decline response looks like because I've seen it in production. I just can't do it in a test environment. In that scenario, like mocking that response from the third party is like great because I can validate my UI, right? But I do agree that if their response ever changes, right, you've got something to maintain. But I don't, I don't recommend mocking all the things, right? But if you say there's this one thing that I want to validate is going to make my system do this and it should, and that's really hard to go create, or it requires very specific test data or a specific ID in a database that you don't know, either sniffing out that network traffic and getting it to go try to do that, or that's kind of what we're doing. We're sniffing out the traffic and then doing something with that data you just don't see in the UI, but you do get in the API. You can do things like that using some of these methods, but I think in your specific scenario, right, it's really going back to intercept the API. If there's data you can use from that, use that in your tests, or to go do other things. But don't rely on like just mocking that and it's going to always work, right? So, but definitely a good point. Very expensive to maintain mocks, and yeah.
Thanks.
So Milo said, yeah, I'll ask the questions and answer them. Milo said, what can we do to contribute to the Playwright solutions? Return the kindness. If you want to write an article, feel free, reach out, let me know. You can hit me up on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place to message me and collaborate, and I can create a login. It's really just a ghost blog, and we can add you as a contributor. Yeah, so I mean, I'm open to that, but I'm not like, yeah, it's great. If you do that, here's what I would commit to. I would commit to reviewing and giving feedback. I do believe feedback is a gift. So, if you're open to feedback, I'm definitely willing to help out wherever needed and give, help in those ways. So I've got another question. Hello, everything is fine. I'm starting with Playwright and C#. Would you have any tips for beginning this framework? I'm talking about Brazil. Thanks. All right. So, C#, you can use Playwright with C#. I've never done it. I will say if you're using Playwright and C#, you're using Playwright library. What that means is you're getting what can Playwright do out of the box? How can it interact with web pages and browser context? But you're not getting any of the test runner, parallelization, video. Well, you do get video recordings, but you don't get the reporting that's kind of built in to Playwright test. So you would just need to be prepared to kind of treat it a lot like a Selenium project, where you're going to bring your own test runner. You're going to, kind of wire up the reporting and and whatnot. So there's a bit more knowledge required to kind of do that and to do it well. But it can be done. I mean, there's successful projects out there. It's not as easy as, NPM init, Playwright. So. Any other questions?
Maybe just one. Did you say that it was a pretty new feature, or has it like been here for a hot minute?
The page route stuff, I believe, has been here for a while. I could go look at that stuff. Some of the page, like route from har, I think is a little newer. That's probably, it feels like it's in the last year, but I think the page.router stuff that, I kind of demoed off a lot has been there for a little while. So at least in the last 3 years, it's been there kind of like, or added since then. So
Gotcha. Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. I'm also a big fan. If you're interested in using Playwright for API testing, I've got like a 14 or 15 article guide on kind of start to finish how to build an environment, how to set up your repo, and how to do that. I found when I was evaluating new tools, joining my new company about 3 years ago, I was really looking for a tool that would do API and UI testing, kind of like in a similar way, so I don't have to train my developers twice, because they go look at these and they've contributed a little bit. Um, and Playwright kind of checked the box about 3 years ago is when they added a lot of the API testing capabilities. So um, awesome. All right, so
Another
Christian
question.
says 2021 is when he used API interception. So there it is.
So 3 years ago. You're right.
Ish, yeah.
So there's another question about your Playwright hoodie. So how to get it?
Oh, Playwright hoodie. I mean, you got to go ask the Playwright team on that. So I was fortunate enough, I put out a bunch of content, and the Playwright team, found me, and I connected with Debbie, and she invited me to come become a Playwright ambassador. So this is what they shipped me for becoming a Playwright ambassador, and um, man, you'd have to ask Debbie over on the Discord or just somewhere. At some point they talked about creating a swag shop, but I haven't seen that yet. So I would, I would encourage that.
All right. I think we're done for today. I think I would say, oh, anything more from you, Butch?
I've got nothing.
Okay. All right. Um, then I would say, let's see. Yeah. Next time we are talking with Benjamin Bishop about identifying code smells. It will be already 2025. So for today, I wish you a nice evening, and for the future, happy Christmas. Have a good ride for the next year, and see you next time.
Thank you.